She gave a homeless man food for years. Then 12 Marines showed up at her wedding in full uniform. "Don't tell me you invited him to the wedding," a guest whispered as the bride ran to embrace a homeless man entering the church. Many turned away, visibly uncomfortable. But minutes later, 12 Marines appeared in formal dress uniforms lined up in perfect formation and saluted the bride in unison. If you believe kindness should never be judged, please like and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us of the power of compassion. Now let's discover the extraordinary story behind this unexpected wedding moment. The elegant sanctuary of St. Mary's Church in San Diego buzzed with anticipation. Floral arrangements adorned the pews, and sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor. Emily Sanchez's wedding day had arrived after months of planning, and guests, in their finest attire, mingled in hushed excitement. Emily stood in the bridal room, her white gown cascading around her like a cloud. Through the partially open door, she could hear the gentle murmur of arriving guests, the rustle of programs, and the soft prelude music from the organ. Her mother fussed with the veil while her bridesmaids arranged the train of her dress. "5 minutes until we begin," the wedding coordinator announced, checking her clipboard with practiced efficiency. That's when Emily saw him through the side window, an elderly man with silver hair standing awkwardly at the church entrance. His suit was threadbare but carefully pressed, his shoes polished despite their worn condition. It was him, the man from the bus stop she had fed every morning for 6 years. Without warning, Emily gathered her gown in her hands and rushed from the bridal room, ignoring her mother's startled cry and the coordinator's panicked, "Emily, wait!" She crossed the foyer in a flutter of white drawing gasps from guests who weren't expecting to see the bride before the ceremony. When she reached the elderly man, she enveloped him in a warm embrace, tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "She's hugging that homeless man," someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Don't tell me you invited him to the wedding," another guest muttered with obvious disapproval. "Is this really appropriate today of all days?" a third voice added. Emily heard the whispers, but paid them no mind. This moment, this connection mattered more than protocol or appearances. "You came," she said softly, looking into the weathered face she had seen almost every day for years, but never this close, never this clearly. Before he could respond, the distinct sound of vehicles pulling up sharply outside the church caught everyone's attention. The double doors at the church entrance swung open with military precision. The church fell silent as 12 United States Marines in full dress blues entered in perfect formation. Their shoes gleamed, their white gloves immaculate, their faces composed in solemn dignity. They moved with the synchronized precision that comes from years of discipline and shared purpose. Guests froze in mid-conversation. Someone dropped a champagne glass, the shattering sound echoing in the sudden silence. What connection could these Marines possibly have to Emily Sanchez, a pastry chef, and the homeless man she had just embraced? The answer would change everyone's understanding of what it means to see beyond appearances and how the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that return in waves. Emily Sanchez started each workday at 4:30 a.m., arriving at Sunrise Bakery in San Diego long before the morning rush. At 30, she had already spent 6 years as the head pastry chef, known throughout the neighborhood for her delicate croissants and melt-in-your-mouth cinnamon rolls. The bakery came alive under her touch flour, dusting the counters, the rich scent of butter warming in the oven, and the gentle hum of the mixer creating a symphony of morning preparations. By 5:15 a.m., the first batch of pastries would emerge golden and perfect, ready to tempt the earliest customers when the doors opened at 6 or 0. But among her co-workers, Emily was known for something else entirely, a daily ritual that began the moment she finished the morning's first batch. "You're doing it again, aren't you?" Carlos the barista would ask, with a mixture of amusement and confusion as Emily carefully wrapped a fresh pastry and poured a cup of coffee into a to-go container. Emily would simply smile, adding a small handwritten note wishing you a peaceful day. She had begun this ritual 6 years ago on her very first day at Sunrise Bakery. Walking to work in the pre-dawn darkness, she had noticed an elderly man sitting alone at the bus stop, his silver hair contrasting with his tattered coat. He wasn't begging, wasn't approaching anyone, just sitting quietly, dignity intact, despite his circumstances. That morning, Emily had offered him a croissant from her lunch bag. The next day, she brought an extra one. By the third day, it had become a commitment. "I don't even know his name," she confided once to her friend Sarah, another baker. "We've never really spoken, but there's something in his eyes, a kind of quiet strength." Sarah had shrugged. "You've always been like this, Em. Remember in college when you adopted that three-legged cat no one wanted? Or when you spent your entire summer helping rebuild that community center?" Emily's childhood had shaped her sensitivity to others' struggles. Growing up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, she understood what it meant to need help, but be too proud to ask. Her mother had instilled in her a philosophy: when you have a little extra, give it. When you don't, give kindness anyway. Not everyone appreciated Emily's morning ritual. Some co-workers rolled their eyes or whispered behind her back. "She's wasting good product," one would say dismissively. One day, he'll take advantage of her kindness. Another predicted with certainty. 3 months ago, Sunrise Bakery had come under new management. During Emily's performance review, her supervisor had expressed concern. "Your personal charity work is admirable," he'd said carefully, leaning forward across his desk. "But some customers have mentioned feeling uncomfortable seeing, well, that sort of interaction so close to our establishment. Perhaps you could support a proper homeless shelter instead." Emily had nodded politely but changed nothing. She simply adjusted her routine, arriving 15 minutes earlier, leaving the food before anyone else arrived. She thought no one had noticed until last week when a new employee spotted her returning from her morning mission. "She's been feeding that bum for years now," the employee whispered to a customer loud enough for Emily to hear. "Every single day." The customer shook her head with a mix of pity and judgment. "Poor thing, thinking she's making a difference." Emily had pretended not to hear, continuing to roll dough with the same care she always showed, but the words stung, not because she cared what others thought, but because they couldn't see what she saw: a human being, not a problem to be avoided. "You're too soft-hearted," her mother had told her when she announced her engagement to Marco, a firefighter who understood her morning ritual because he had his own ways of helping strangers. "Always picking up strays, always giving away what you've earned," her mother had sighed, though there was pride beneath the concern. But Emily knew something others didn't. that giving wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about seeing the invisible people that others walked past every day. Emily had never actually spoken with the elderly man beyond brief greetings. Their interaction was limited to nods and occasional eye contact. But one rainy morning in December, she noticed him shivering on his bench, the thin jacket offering little protection against the unseasonable cold. Without hesitation, she placed her own worn wool scarf beside the usual breakfast. The next day, she found a note scrawled in shaky pencil on the back of her usual napkin. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Emily kept that note in her wallet, taking it out occasionally when the world seemed particularly cold or indifferent. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures made the deepest impact. As Emily's wedding day approached, the challenges to her morning ritual intensified. The new manager at Sunrise Bakery, a sharp-eyed man named Richard Thompson, had begun tracking inventory with meticulous precision. "There seems to be a discrepancy in our pastry count," he mentioned one afternoon, scrolling through spreadsheets on his tablet. "Any idea why we're short one croissant and one coffee almost every day?" Emily met his gaze steadily. "I pay for those myself, Richard. I've been deducting it from my paycheck since day one." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And this personal project of yours, don't you think it might be creating dependency? Enabling someone who should be seeking proper assistance?" Emily had heard these arguments before, wrapped in different words, but carrying the same judgment. "With all due respect, I'm not trying to solve homelessness. I'm just making sure one person doesn't start their day hungry." The conversation ended there, but Emily felt the increased scrutiny. Richard began scheduling her for later shifts, making her morning routine more difficult. When she adjusted by coming in even earlier, he implemented a new security protocol requiring 2 staff members to open the bakery together. "It's for safety," he explained, though his glance told Emily he knew exactly what he was doing. Emily found herself waking at 3:30 a.m. to maintain her commitment. The lack of sleep began to show in the dark circles under her eyes concerning Marco. "Babe, you can't keep this up," he said one evening, massaging her shoulders as she slumped exhausted on their couch. "Maybe just weekends, or find another way to help." Emily leaned into his touch. "I can't explain it, Marco. It's not just about the food. It's about consistency, about being someone he can count on when the rest of the world has been unreliable." Marco understood better than most. As a firefighter, he'd seen how quickly life could unravel, how thin the line was between stability and crisis. "Just promise you won't burn yourself out before our wedding. I'm marrying you, not a zombie." Emily smiled, grateful for his support, even when he didn't fully understand her determination. The greatest challenge came 2 weeks before the wedding. Emily arrived at the bus stop with her usual package to find someone had installed a no loitering sign overnight. Worse, a security guard from the nearby bank was actively moving people along. "Can't sit here anymore, sir," the guard was saying to the elderly man as Emily approached. "New policy." Emily watched as the man gathered his few possessions with quiet dignity. Their eyes met briefly as he turned to leave, and Emily felt a stab of helplessness. Where would he go now? For 3 days, she searched the surrounding blocks before her shift, the carefully wrapped breakfast growing cold in her hands. On the 4th morning, she finally spotted him huddled in the doorway of an abandoned store 2 streets over. "I thought I'd lost you," she said, placing the package beside him with relief. He looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face at her direct address. "You looked for me?" It was the first real exchange they'd ever had. Emily nodded, suddenly shy, despite their years of silent interaction. "Nobody looks for me," he said simply, his voice gravelly from disuse. Emily wanted to say more, to ask his name, to find out his story, but something in his expression, a guarded privacy, made her step back. "Enjoy your breakfast," she said instead, honoring the boundaries of their unusual connection. That evening, she told Marco about finding him. "I think he was surprised I cared enough to search." Marco considered this as he chopped vegetables for dinner. "You know, in the fire service we have this saying, 'The rescue isn't complete until everyone's safe.' Sounds like you're living that." As their wedding approached, Emily faced one final challenge. Her mother's increasing concern about wedding costs led to an uncomfortable conversation. "Darling, I've added up everything, and we're already over budget. Maybe we could cut the guest list. Perhaps not invite everyone." Her mother's meaningful glance made her meaning clear. Emily stood firm. "Every person I've invited matters to me, Mom, including my colleagues from the bakery." She didn't mention her hope that the elderly man might somehow attend, though she had no way to formally invite him. The night before her wedding, Emily prepared a special package, her finest chocolate croissant and a cup of the premium coffee they reserved for catering. With it, she left a note. "Tomorrow, I marry the man I love. Your quiet presence in my mornings has taught me about dignity and perseverance. Thank you." She had no way of knowing if he would understand the significance or if he would even be there to receive it. But the gesture felt important, acknowledging this silent witness to 6 years of her life. 2 days before the wedding, an unmarked hand-delivered letter arrived at the reception venue. The envelope, addressed simply to the bride Emily Sanchez, contained a card with neatly penned well wishes and a single line that puzzled the wedding planner. "Tomorrow I will come not for cake, but to honor a debt." There was no signature, no return address. Emily wondered if it might be from a distant relative or one of Marco's firefighter colleagues, but something about the handwriting stirred a faint recognition she couldn't quite place. "Any idea who sent this?" Marco asked, examining the card with curiosity. Emily traced the careful penmanship with her fingertip. "It feels familiar somehow, but I can't place it." That same evening, Emily received an unexpected visit from Carlos, the barista, who had worked alongside her for years. "I thought you should know," he said, shifting uncomfortably on her doorstep. "Richard fired me today." "What? Why?" Emily pulled him inside, shocked by the news. Carlos sighed. "He said it was budget cuts, but I know the real reason. He caught me leaving food for your guy yesterday when you called in sick for the wedding preparations." Emily felt a rush of gratitude mixed with guilt. "Carlos, I'm so sorry." He shrugged. "Don't be. I've been watching you do this for years. Made me realize I've been sleepwalking through life, not really seeing people. Yesterday was the first time I actually looked at him. I mean, really looked. He thanked me, and there was something in his eyes. A kind of quiet strength." Emily finished nodding. "Exactly. Anyway, he asked about you. Wanted to know if you were okay since you hadn't come by. I told him about your wedding." Carlos hesitated. "I hope that was all right." Emily assured him it was fine touched that the man had noticed her absence. She insisted Carlos come to the wedding, promising to help him find another job after the honeymoon. After Carlos left, Emily found herself thinking about the mysterious man more intensely than ever. 6 years of mournings, and she knew almost nothing about him. Yet somehow he had become significant in her life, a constant in her changing world. The day before the wedding, Emily was handling last-minute details when her phone rang. It was Sarah from the bakery. "Em, something weird just happened. A guy in a military uniform came asking about you." Emily's heart skipped. "Military? What did he want?" "He wouldn't say exactly. Just asked when your wedding was and where. He seemed really formal, like official business." "I didn't tell him anything," Sarah added quickly. "Told him to contact you directly." "Did he leave a name or number?" "No, but he had captain's bars on his uniform. Navy or Marines, I think." "Do you know anyone in the military?" Emily didn't, at least not that she was aware of. Marco had some friends in emergency services who had military backgrounds, but none that would be in uniform now, or asking about her specifically. That night, unable to sleep with pre-wedding jitters, Emily sat at her window, watching the quiet street below. Her mind circled back to the elderly man at the bus stop. Would he miss their morning ritual when she took time off for her honeymoon? Would he wonder where she'd gone? She realized with a start how little she knew about him, yet how much she cared about his well-being. 6 years of small kindnesses had created a connection that defied conventional relationships. As dawn broke on her wedding day, Emily found herself driving to the abandoned storefront where she had last seen him. The street was empty, the doorway vacant. Had he moved on again? Was he okay? She left the package anyway, a croissant, coffee, and a note explaining her absence for the next 2 weeks. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a small object leaning against the wall where he usually sat. It was a carefully folded origami crane made from what appeared to be a page from a military manual. Beneath it was a small card that simply read, "For your wedding day, Semper Fi." Emily stared at the items, confusion and wonder mingling. How did he know today was her wedding? And what did this military reference mean? She carefully placed the crane and card in her purse, a strange feeling growing that there was much more to her morning ritual than she had ever imagined. On the morning of her wedding, Emily was a bundle of nerves and excitement as she prepared in the church's bridal room. Through the window, she could see guests arriving, family members, friends, co-workers in their finest attire. Her mother fussed over her veil while bridesmaids made last-minute adjustments to their dresses. That's when she spotted him, the elderly man from the bus stop, now standing somewhat awkwardly at the church entrance, wearing his threadbare but carefully pressed suit, his silver hair combed neatly. For the first time, Emily could see his face clearly weathered by time and hardship, but dignified. Several guests had noticed him too. Emily overheard their whispers through the partially open door. "Who invited the homeless man? Don't tell me you invited him to the wedding. Is he looking for handouts at a wedding now?" Emily's heart sank at their words. Without thinking about the carefully planned processional, the photographer's schedule, or any other wedding protocol, she gathered her white gown in her hands and rushed from the bridal room. She crossed the church foyer in a flutter of white, ignoring the gasps from guests and the frantic calls of her wedding planner. When she reached the elderly man, She enveloped him in a warm embrace, tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "I still remember your eyes the first time in 2017, she whispered. He smiled a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "I remember every single morning you treated me like a human being," he replied in a voice stronger and clearer than she had imagined. As Emily linked her arm through his to escort him inside, her wedding planner approached confusion evident on her face. "Emily, the ceremony is about to start. Who is this gentleman?" Before Emily could answer, the distinct sound of vehicles pulling up sharply outside the church caught everyone's attention. The double doors at the church entrance swung open with military precision. The church fell silent as 12 United States Marines in full dress blues entered in perfect formation. Their shoes gleamed, their white gloves immaculate, their faces composed in solemn dignity. They moved with the synchronized precision that comes from years of discipline and shared purpose. Guests froze in mid-conversation. Someone dropped a champagne glass, the shattering sound echoing in the sudden silence. The lead Marine, a captain with Duncan on his nameplate, stepped forward with practiced precision. He came to attention before Emily and rendered a perfect military salute. On behalf of Alpha Company 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, he announced, his voice carrying throughout the church, "We are here to honor the woman who silently sustained a hero for 6 years." Emily stood stunned, her hand still holding the elderly man's arm. Confused murmurs rippled through the wedding guests. Captain Duncan turned slightly, gesturing toward the elderly man at Emily's side. "This is Sergeant Victor Hale, a Marine who saved 9 lives during an ambush in Fallujah in 2004. After losing his entire family to a car accident in 2016, he chose to disappear from society, never once using his military benefits or revealing his identity." The revelation sent shock waves through the gathering. Guests who had been whispering just moments before now stared in disbelief. Another Marine stepped forward, presenting Emily with a shadow box containing a medal and a faded photograph. The image showed a younger Victor Hale carrying a blood-covered Marine through what appeared to be a war-torn street, and in the background, unmistakably, was a younger version of Captain Duncan. "Sergeant Hale carried me 4 blocks under enemy fire after I took shrapnel to both legs," Duncan explained, his voice steady but emotional. He returned for 8 more Marines that day despite being wounded himself. His actions earned him the Silver Star, which he never claimed. Duncan bowed his head slightly before continuing. "If not for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. And if not for you, Ms. Sanchez, he might not have survived to see this day." Emily's makeup was beyond saving now as tears flowed freely down her cheeks. "I never knew," she whispered, looking at Victor with new understanding. "That was the point," Victor replied gently. "I didn't want to be thanked for doing my duty. After losing my wife and daughter, I couldn't bear to be around people who saw me as a hero when I couldn't even save my own family." He paused, emotion briefly overcoming his composure. "But you never asked who I was. You never demanded my story. You just fed me, saw me, left notes that gave me a reason to wake up each morning." The Marines had arranged themselves in a formal line, creating an honor guard that extended from the church entrance to the altar. Captain Duncan addressed the gathered guests. "Ms. Sanchez never knew she was helping a decorated war hero. She simply helped a human being in need day after day, year after year without recognition or reward. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on those who had been whispering just minutes earlier. In the Corps, we have a saying, "Never leave a Marine behind." Emily Sanchez, who never served a day in uniform, understood this principle better than many who wear the uniform. One of the bridesmaids, tears streaming down her face, stepped forward. "I work with Emily at the bakery. She arrives early every day to bake extra pastries, paying for the ingredients herself just to make sure he had fresh food." "She never told anyone," added another co-worker, shame evident in her voice. We teased her for it." A guest stood up, overcome with emotion. "We're witnessing not just a wedding, but a military honor ceremony." Victor turned to Emily, his weathered hands taking hers. "I came today to give you the only gift I have left, my presence, my truth, and my gratitude. I knew you were getting married because I overheard you mentioning it to a customer. I hope you don't mind that I contacted some old friends." Emily smiled through her tears. "This is the most beautiful wedding gift imaginable." Marco, the groom, who had been watching this unfold with amazement, finally approached, extending his hand to Victor. "Sir, I would be honored if you would join our ceremony. Perhaps walk Emily down the aisle." Victor's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears of his own. "The honor would be mine," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. As the wedding music began to play, Emily took Victor's arm. The Marines formed an honor guard, standing at attention as Emily and Victor walked down the aisle together, followed by the bridesmaids and groomsmen. When they reached the altar, Victor carefully placed Emily's hand in Marco's, then stepped back to join the Marines in formation. The ceremony proceeded, but it was no longer just about Emily and Marco's union. It had become something larger, a celebration of humanity, of seeing beyond appearances, of the profound impact that daily acts of kindness can have. Following their honeymoon, Emily didn't return to Sunrise Bakery. Instead, she and Marco used their wedding gift money to start a small program called The Quiet Table, a breakfast service for homeless veterans in their neighborhood. They converted a vacant storefront near their apartment into a simple dining space with 6 tables each, adorned with fresh flowers and proper place settings. Unlike typical soup kitchens, the Quiet Table operated with restaurant-like dignity. Guests were seated, served, and treated with respect. Emily rose at 4:30 each morning to bake fresh pastries, just as she had at sunrise. Marco helped before his shifts at the fire station, and Carlos, who had been fired for following Emily's example, became their first full-time employee. There were no photographers documenting their work, no press releases announcing their mission, just a simple wooden sign with carved letters, "Feeding one person feeds an entire life that might otherwise be forgotten." Victor Hale didn't appear at the Quiet Table after the wedding, but each month Emily would receive a postcard from different locations around the country, each bearing the same message: "Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Emily." Captain Duncan had explained that Victor was finally using his VA benefits to receive proper medical care and trauma counseling. The Marines had helped him secure housing and reconnect with the military community he had abandoned years ago. He needed to face his past, Duncan explained during one of his frequent visits to the Quiet Table. Your kindness gave him the strength to do that. Word spread quietly among veterans in San Diego about the small breakfast place where no one asked questions about your past or your circumstances. Within 3 months, The quiet table was serving 30 to 40 people each morning. Emily noticed that many of their regular guests began helping out, clearing tables, washing dishes, or simply sitting with newcomers who seemed particularly lost. A community was forming around the simple act of sharing breakfast. Richard, Emily's former manager at Sunrise Bakery, stopped by one morning clearly uncomfortable but determined. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Emily offered him coffee and a seat. "What changed your mind?" "My father," Richard admitted. "He's a Vietnam vet, never talks about it. But after hearing about what happened at your wedding, it's all over the bakery gossip. I asked him about his experience coming home from war." Richard's eyes grew distant. "He told me things he's never shared before, about how invisible he felt when he returned, how a simple acknowledgement of his humanity would have meant everything." By the end of their conversation, Richard had offered to supply the quiet table with day-old pastries from Sunrise at no cost, a small gesture, but a meaningful one. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Emily and Marco arrived at the quiet table to find the 12 Marines waiting for them, this time in civilian clothes, each holding a single flower. "We'll be taking shifts volunteering here," Captain Duncan announced. "This honor isn't one we'll allow to be forgotten." What had begun as one woman's daily act of kindness had grown into something much larger. Veterans from across San Diego now knew about the quiet table, a place where they could receive a meal without questions, judgment, or the need to explain their circumstances. Emily kept Victor's original note framed above the serving counter. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Below it, she had added her own message. "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." The quiet table never became famous or received major funding. It operated on donations, volunteer labor, and the modest savings of a firefighter and a former pastry chef. But its impact was measured in changed lives rather than dollars. A former Marine who had been living in his car for 3 years found the courage to reconnect with his estranged daughter after months of breakfasts at the quiet table. An Army veteran suffering from PTSD began helping Emily in the kitchen, discovering that baking provided a meditative focus that eased his symptoms. Carlos, once just a barista who watched Emily's morning ritual with curiosity, now managed the daily operations with passionate dedication. "This place saved me too," he confided to Emily. "I was just going through the motions before. Now I have purpose." 6 months later, a local news crew discovered the quiet table and requested an interview. Emily politely declined, suggesting they speak with the veterans instead. "This isn't about me," she explained. "It's about seeing the invisible people all around us." The resulting news segment focused on the veterans' stories and the unique atmosphere of dignity at the quiet table. By the following week, 3 similar initiatives had sprung up in neighboring communities inspired by their model. On particularly difficult mornings when supplies ran low or volunteers didn't show, Emily would remember her wedding day, the moment 12 Marines stood at attention for a simple act of daily kindness. It was all the motivation she needed to continue. Marco understood completely. As a firefighter, he knew that heroism wasn't always about dramatic rescues or running into burning buildings. Sometimes it was about the quiet consistency of showing up day after day, offering kindness without expectation of recognition or reward. "You know," he told Emily one evening, as they closed up the quiet table. "When I married you, I got not just a wife, but 12 Marines and a growing family of veterans." Emily smiled. "The best kind of family, the kind you choose, and the kind that chooses you back." 3 years after Emily's wedding, the quiet table had become a fixture in the community. What began as a small breakfast service now operated 7 days a week, serving over 100 veterans daily. The original 6 tables had multiplied to 20, and a second location had opened across town, managed by one of their first regular guests, a former Navy corpsman who had found his way back from despair through the simple dignity of being seen. On a crisp autumn morning, as Emily prepared the day's first batch of pastries, the bell above the door chimed unexpectedly. They weren't due to open for another hour. She looked up to see Victor Hale standing in the doorway, no longer in threadbare clothes, but dressed in a neat button-down shirt and slacks. His silver hair was trimmed, his posture straighter than she remembered. "Victor!" Emily rushed forward, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron before embracing him. He returned the hug with surprising strength. "I promised myself I'd come back when I was ready," he said, his voice steadier than she remembered, "when I had something to offer besides gratitude." Victor had spent the past 3 years rebuilding his life, accepting treatment for PTSD, reconnecting with fellow Marines, and eventually becoming a peer counselor for veterans struggling with trauma and loss. "I work with the VA now," he explained, as Emily served him coffee at a quiet corner table, "helping others who've disappeared like I did, showing them there's a way back." Emily noticed he carried a worn leather portfolio. Victor followed her gaze and opened it, revealing dozens of photographs, the quiet table locations that had sprung up in cities across the country. 27 so far," he said with quiet pride. "All started by veterans who found their way here or heard the story. Each one named after yours, a place where people are seen, not served." He pushed a folded document across the table. "The Duncan Hale Veterans Foundation wants to help you expand. Not to change what you're doing, that perfect simplicity is what makes it work, but to support similar efforts nationwide." Emily stared at the check attached to the proposal, her eyes widening at the amount. "Victor, this is a drop in the bucket compared to what you gave me," he finished. "You didn't just feed me, Emily. You anchored me to this world when I was ready to drift away. You reminded me daily that I was still human when I'd forgotten." As they talked, the staff and volunteers began arriving. Carlos, now the program director; Sarah, who had left the bakery to manage their community outreach; and a dozen veterans who had transitioned from guests to helpers. Marco arrived last, coming straight from his overnight shift at the fire station. Seeing Victor, he broke into a wide grin and embraced the older man like family. "The prodigal Marine returns," he said warmly, "just in time for our anniversary." Emily looked up in surprise. "The wedding anniversary isn't for 2 more months." Marco shook his head. "Not that one. Today marks exactly 9 years since you first gave Victor breakfast at the bus stop. I checked your old journals." Emily was touched that Marco had remembered a date she herself had forgotten. 9 years of mornings, beginning with the simplest act of acknowledgement. As they prepared to open for the day, Emily gathered everyone in a circle, a tradition they had established to center themselves before serving. Usually, they shared a thought or intention for the day ahead. Today, Victor spoke, I was a sergeant in the Marines for 12 years. I led men into combat, made life or death decisions, received medals for courage under fire. But the bravest person I've ever known is a pastry chef who wasn't afraid to see humanity where others saw only brokenness. He turned to address the group of volunteers. What you do here isn't charity. It's recognition. It's seeing the person behind the circumstance. Never underestimate how powerful that is, how life-changing it can be to simply acknowledge someone's existence when the rest of the world walks by. As they opened the doors for another day, Emily watched the first veterans enter some new faces, some regulars. Each was greeted by name, if known, or with a warm welcome, if not. No questions about their past, no requirements to share their stories, just the simple dignity of being treated as valued guests. Above the entrance, a new sign had been installed that morning, a gift from Captain Duncan and his Marines. Carved in wood were the words, "The most powerful act of courage is to see another's humanity when the world has looked away." Emily thought about how differently her life might have unfolded if she hadn't noticed Victor that first morning, or if she had given up her ritual when faced with disapproval. One small daily kindness had rippled outward, touching hundreds of lives, now creating a community where there had been isolation. Marco slipped his arm around her waist as they watched the quiet table come alive with conversation and connection. "You know what I love most about this place?" he asked. "What's that? It proves that heroism isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a cup of coffee offered without expectation." Emily leaned against him, thinking of all the invisible acts of kindness happening every day, the small gestures that went unnoticed but still changed lives. The homeless individuals we pass on street corners might be former teachers who shaped young minds, nurses who once saved lives, or veterans who carried wounded comrades through gunfire. Their current circumstances don't erase who they were or who they still are beneath the layers of hardship. The elderly man on the bus bench might be a decorated hero. The woman sleeping in her car could be a former concert pianist. The person panhandling might once have saved lives as a first responder. As the quiet table filled with morning light and quiet conversation, Emily reflected on how easy it would have been to miss this path entirely. If she had listened to the whispers, if she had prioritized convenience over consistency, if she had seen Victor as a problem rather than a person, none of this would exist. "Sometimes I wonder about all the connections we miss," she said softly to Marco. "All the people we pass by without really seeing." "That's why what started here matters so much," Marco replied. "It reminds us to look up from our phones, to make eye contact, to acknowledge the humanity around us." Victor joined them by the window, watching as veterans of different eras, Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, sat together, the invisible walls between generations dissolving over shared meals. "In the Corps, we say, 'Semper Fidelis,' always faithful," Victor said. Emily lived that motto more faithfully than many who wore the uniform. Always faithful to the simple act of human kindness, day after day without recognition. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to close, a young woman entered hesitantly. She wasn't a veteran, that much was clear from her nervous demeanor and civilian clothing, but Emily welcomed her warmly. "I've been walking past this place for weeks," the woman admitted. "I work at the bank down the street. I've seen what happens here every morning, and I want to help. I don't have much money, but I have time. Emily recognized something in the young woman's eyes, the same spark that had led her to offer that first breakfast 9 years ago. The desire to connect, to make a difference, however small. "What's your name?" Emily asked. "Sarah," the woman replied. "Well, Sarah, the most important thing we do here isn't providing food. It's providing recognition. Can you see people really see them beyond their circumstances?" Sarah nodded earnestly. "I think that's why I'm here. I want to learn how." As Emily showed Sarah around explaining their philosophy and approach, she realized they had come full circle. What had begun with one person seeing another had grown into a community of seeing and being seen. That evening, after everyone had left, Emily sat alone at one of the tables, looking at the collection of photographs that now lined the walls. Veterans who had found their way back, volunteers who had discovered purpose, communities that had been strengthened. In the center was the framed note from Victor. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She thought about all the mornings she had doubted herself, all the whispers and judgments she had endured, all the times she had wondered if her small gesture mattered at all. Now she knew the truth, that in a world obsessed with grand gestures and viral fame, true heroism often lives in the smallest acts of consistent compassion delivered without an audience. Marco found her there, lost in thought, and sat beside her. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Emily smiled. "I was just thinking about how we never know the ripples our actions create. 9 years ago, I just wanted to make sure one person didn't start their day hungry. I never imagined all of this." "That's how the best things grow," Marco said. "Not from grand plans or perfect strategies, but from simple human connections nurtured day by day." As they prepared to leave, Emily looked back at the quiet table, this space where dignity was served alongside breakfast, where veterans found not just nourishment, but recognition, where volunteers discovered that giving often heals the giver as much as the receiver. Tomorrow morning, they would rise before dawn. Emily would bake fresh pastries, Marco would brew coffee, and together they would open their doors to those who had served their country, but now found themselves forgotten. They would greet each person by name when possible, with respect always, and with the simple acknowledgement that every human being deserves to be seen. In a world where people often feel invisible, the quiet table stood as a reminder that sometimes the most profound act of courage is simply to see another person's humanity when everyone else has looked away. And that small, consistent acts of kindness, a pastry, a coffee, a handwritten note, can create ripples that return as waves, transforming not just individual lives, but entire communities. Emily's daily ritual had grown beyond anything she could have imagined, touching hundreds of lives now, but its essence remained unchanged. The simple, powerful act of seeing the person behind the circumstance, of acknowledging the dignity in every human being, regardless of their situation. Live with kindness, not for recognition, but because someday you might witness 12 people bowing their heads for something you never thought to celebrate. In a world obsessed with grand gestures and viral fame, remember that true heroism often lives in the smallest acts of consistent compassion delivered without an audience. Because the greatest heroes often eat alone. Disclaimer: this content is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. The story All names, characters, and incidents portrayed in this production are fictitious. No identification with actual persons living or deceased places, buildings, and products is intended or should be inferred. No person or entity associated with this content has received any payment or anything of value or entered into any agreement in connection with the depiction of tobacco products. This video is not intended to defame, insult, or convey false information about any individual,